Thank you. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening. I'm going to kick off straight away and get into things because we're running slightly behind time. And we Jamaican people like to be precise with the time. Really, really precious. I'm just joking. We're not. I'm going to talk about decolonising Black British gospel music, a musicological experiment. Just to say a bit about myself. Again, I work in 3 locations. My dad is from Westmoreland in Jamaica, and he always used to say to me when I was growing up, you can't have one job in England and survive, you see. So to be a bona fide Beckford, you see, you have to have 3 jobs in my family. So my main job is at the University of Winchester, where I work on climate justice, social justice projects, both here and overseas, but also have a hand in the largest cohort of Black students studying theology in the UK at the Queen's Ecumenical Foundation. We have 80 Black postgraduate students, master's degrees, PhD students. Theological studies in Britain is a bit of an apartheid discipline. So all the Black people are focused at Queen's, and there are only 1.5 lecturers currently who are Black teaching theology in mainstream universities. A big crisis around that at the moment. And also do work with the Dutch university, VU University in Amsterdam, one of the top 3 universities in Holland, one of the top 20 theological departments in the world, just to show that I can do the dead white man theology still, and keep that side of my academic life going. This project will culminate in a book project, which is out next year. I've finished the book, but I haven't handed it over to the publishers yet because I'm still not quite happy with the way that it feels, but it will be out sometime next year, called Decolonising Contemporary Gospel Music. I've changed the title. The title now is called Handsworth Revolutions, after the album by Steel Pulse, because I borrow ideas from the reggae band Steel Pulse to think about decolonising the music. Okay, so let's get into this subject then. Look, this is really about decolonising the music. And in order to decolonise the music, we've got to get a grip on what we mean by decolonisation or gospel music, and obviously how we then think what the problem is in terms of colonialism. But let's just have a little flavour of contemporary gospel music. This is Vonley Morgan and Newey, just a couple of seconds of them doing their thing, just to get in the spirit of what gospel is about in contemporary Britain. Right, come on then, let's go, come on. I'm just joking. You ready? Time is winding down. It's not forever. Come on and pick up. If you did it for me. Listen, though he slay me, though he try me, come on, lift up your voice. What is your love? For grace is done. I can't hear you. Jump on your feet. Praise him with me. Everybody scream. All right, there you go. Gospel music. Well, my thesis is quite critical when it comes to thinking about gospel music. My thesis is this. Gospel music in Britain is soulful, but it lacks the soul of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's soulful music because it is sung from the heart. It is passionate. It is works with some of the great traditions of Black orality, what Cornel West would call the expressive physicality of Black worship, the kinetic orality of Black worship. And it's deeply effective. It impacts the emotions. It's body theology. It impacts all of your being. It's holistic. However, in terms of its lyricism, what it talks about, the images of God that are conveyed in the language of the songs, is soulful. It's not necessarily the soul of the gospel. Why? Because the soul of the gospel of Jesus is liberation. Won't go into all the scriptures here. I'm sure you're all good church-going folk, but let me just take 2 of them. In the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the key text defining the work of God in the world is the book of Exodus. key in terms of Judaism, key in terms of Christianity. Why? Because it describes a God who intervenes in human history to bring about socio-political transformation. The Hebrews are liberated from bondage in Egypt. And we know how much that passage meant in African Caribbean history. Just think about the spiritual go down Moses and how people reflected on that past history to make sense of their current predicament as enslaved Africans. The New Testament equivalent of that is when Jesus begins his ministry. Jesus begins his ministry in the book of Luke, Luke chapter 4. It's really amazing what he does. He goes back to his hometown and he opens up the scrolls and he reads from Isaiah 61. Really important text because Isaiah is talking about the failure of the people to do justice in the history of the Hebrew people. Why did they fail to do justice? Because they failed to acknowledge and participate in the Jubilee. The Jubilee was a tradition where every 7 years, every seven years, you were meant to give the land back to the people that had been taken away through either theft, destruction of crops, or destitution. It was a way in which God wanted to equalize society. And it comes out of a smaller tradition called the sabbatical. Sabbatical is great because every seven years, God said to the people, you cancel all the debts, so your credit card bills disappear. Every 7 years. People who had nothing to eat were able to go in the fields and eat. This is where it gets kind of tricky in Caribbean history, because then we're told that the enslaved people were set free. And we don't know what are doing enslaved people in the first place. And God is this, But the whole point was that every 7 years there was meant to be a reordering. So Isaiah is talking about that. Jesus then appropriates that text to say, this is what my ministry is about. That tradition, that radical tradition of social equalization, it starts now. So you've got these two powerful texts dominating the Old Testament, the New Testament, the lenses for, that's the soul of the gospel. So it then raises the question, where in contemporary gospel music do we find language, images, and thoughts about socio-political change, where salvation isn't just individual, but social? So that's my thesis. It's soulful, but it lacks the soul of the gospel. That's kind of controversial for church folk, but work with me. So what I'm saying is, look, soulful. The soul of the gospel is liberation. I think I've got a quote here. The Old Testament states that God demands justice for the weak and the fatherless, opposition to oppression in Isaiah, and equal treatment of all of God's people in James and New Testament. Justice is not confined to the human species, it extends to all of creation, naturally working sustainability. I push that line. Furthermore, many argue that the life of Jesus is the example par excellence of social justice in actions. What I'm saying is, the heart of the gospel message is justice. It is about an understanding of salvation that's not just individual, but social, cultural, economic, and environmental. That's the soul of the gospel. Okay, Karen's here tonight. I didn't know you were coming. I thought I would use a different slide, Karen. So my argument is that they almost get there. Gospel music in Britain almost gets to being about the soul of the gospel, because I think it's one of the clearest examples where this song, this is the Kingdom Choir. Karen Gibson from the Kingdom Choir is here tonight. We're very privileged to have Karen with us. This is where they reversion Storms' Blinded by Your Grace. And as they go into the church in the video, there are these signs of protest. So, I was kind of intrigued, but none of them actually give you a clear steer towards what they are actually protesting. Because the protest imagery is still very much about a soulful approach to the gospel, where the gospel is about individual concerns, feeling good, feeling empowered, not necessarily confronting the injustice around you. So I'm saying the gospel music it's almost there, but not quite there in terms of being right, in terms of having the soul of the gospel. So what I want to do is show you how I think we can get there. And this is part of the experiment that I've done. Whoops, hold on. Let's see, for some reason let's go bit too fast. There we go, hold on. There you go. So I want to show you how I get there in terms of then decolonizing gospel music. For me, the soulful stuff is about the continuity of colonialism within the gospel music tradition because it's there within the church. I'm going to show you how I get to that point of decolonizing by acknowledging the coloniality within contemporary gospel music. So I'm going to do three things. I'm going to talk about colonial Christianity. I'm going to show you how it continues to inform gospel music. And then I'm going to give you examples of how in my own work as a theologian and working with artists have attempted to decolonize gospel music. Okay, you still with me? See, because you're so used to teaching students, you see, they're always looking at their phones now saying, we've had enough, we've had £55 worth, we can write the essay now based on everything we've had. So let's look at the coloniality then. Look, colonial Christianity is fundamentally the Christianity that was brought to the New World by missionaries to teach the gospel to enslaved Africans. Now, the problem that the missionaries had in the 17th and 18th century was this. If they preached the whole gospel, there was a problem because it would mean that enslaved Africans might think that they are equal to the people enslaving them and therefore think that becoming Christian would make them free. So the way in which the missionaries got round this was to preach a form of Christianity that was corrupt. They basically said you can be free as a Christian, but not free as a human being. And then they created a whole ecology, a whole theological system that legitimated black subordination alongside being a Christian person. So it's a corrupt form of Christianity. And that's what we mean when we talk about colonial Christianity, the way in which the gospel was manipulated, corrupted, and distorted to legitimate black subordination in the West Indies. There are great examples of this. When I do this in the classroom with students, I show them the 1807 published Bible in London, which is colloquially known as the Slave Bible, where missionaries in Britain took out all the texts in the New Testament and Old Testament that may possibly inspire Africans to see themselves as being equal to Europeans. Took them all out. And what was left, they told the slaves that this is the Bible. I mean, how corrupt is that? It's one thing to say to people, you're less than, but then to kind of distort the biblical text in that way is a whole nother level of corruption. That's colonial Christianity. One of the ways in which I've attempted to explore this recently in film work is through a film that I made earlier this year for the Movement for Justice and Reconciliation. The film is called After the Flood, Slavery, Christianity and Reconciliation. It's a talking head film made for the American student market, because they'll pay the license fee, the British films won't. So what we do in this film is we explain how colonial Christianity is deeply connected to the notion of whiteness, what it means to be white in the world. And we got Willie Jennings from Yale to explain this as part of the film, and I'm just going to play this part to you.
The first element were Christians in the old world, of what we would now call Europe. They understood themselves to be the people of God who replaced Israel as the people of God. That God had chosen Israel, then because of Israel's quote-unquote rejection of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, God rejected them in this way of thinking. And when God rejected Israel, God turned to those who had accepted Jesus Christ, thus the church. And the church became the people of God. Now, why this is so important is because with that idea of replacing Israel, they saw themselves at the very center of God's activity in the world. So when we come to what many historians have called the age of discovery, which we always have to be careful with that statement, because the indigenous and native peoples around the world, they don't see themselves as ever having been discovered. But let's just use that language. When they came to the new worlds of what we would call the Americas, Pacific Islands, China, the sub-Saharan parts of Africa, one, they were coming there because out of the providence of God, the plan of God, God wanted them there. And because God brought them there, something else was going to result. God had brought them there to offer to indigenous peoples, native peoples, the truth of Christianity. But now that truth of Christianity was not just a set of ideas, God was also giving them responsibility for the land and for the animals and for the environment, so that they were going to mature the people and mature the environment at the same time. Element number 3, they were in a powerful position to name who these people were. So the naming of them has to do with the way they described who they were and described themselves in relationship to who they were. And in that scale of existence, whiteness stands at one end as the kind of highest end of human maturity, productivity, and transformation. People being aligned not only with what God wants, but with who they should actually be as fully developed human beings. And at the other end stands Blackness, or the African, at the very opposite of that level of maturity. And all people can be plotted somewhere along the line. So some peoples were closer to the Europeans, some people were closer to the Africans. But now let's add that 4th element, that is the claiming. The claiming had to do with taking command and taking control of the land, of the animals, of the natural resources, and the people, and bringing them to productive use. Now, why is this so important? Because it's out of these 4 elements that the idea of whiteness comes to be. And whiteness is not just an idea about skin color. Whiteness is a way of being in the world and a way of seeing the world at the same time. And whiteness happens because one has the power to order a world by that way of seeing and that way of being.
So do you see, when we're talking about colonial Christianity, we're not just talking about a set of ideas that inform the way in which Christianity, out of that set of ideas comes a whole understanding of what it means to be human ontology, being. And at one scale we have whiteness, and at the other end of the scale we have blackness. And colonial Christianity is bound up with this. And I'm going to show you how it gets played out in the West Indies. This is Count Ludwig von Nicholas von Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf is the father of the Moravian Church. He goes to Jamaica in the early 1700s and preaches this sermon. This is an excerpt from the sermon that he preaches. It was really, really fascinating because the Moravians in Europe are very radical, very proletariat, very much for the poor. When they go to the West Indies, they become part and parcel of the slave regime. They don't resist slavery, they collude with it. And in this sermon that he preaches, he says to the enslaved people, look, be true to your husbands and wives and obedient to your masters. Look at this, he says, the Lord has made all ranks, kings, masters, servants, and slaves. So it's folding Christianity into racial hierarchy. Then he says, God has punished the first Negroes by making them slaves. Well, that buys into a myth in the Hebrew Bible called the curse of Ham. Curse of Ham never happened. Ham wasn't cursed. It was Canaan who was cursed. And it wasn't even anything to do with blackness. No Hebrew Bible scholar ever has worked out what Ham means. Some thought it meant burnt, because if you corrupt the words, it can mean burnt or dark. It doesn't mean that. The curse has absolutely nothing to do with black people, but it was used up until the 1990s by the Southern Baptists. The Southern Baptists only renounced using that text in the 1990s. Been used in commentaries up until the 1980s as if it's factual. It's a load of lies. It's myth. But he's using that to say that the biblical text legitimates your subordination and your conversion will make you free, not from the control of your masters, but simply from your wicked habits and thoughts, and that makes you dissatisfied with your lot. A tradition that emerges in the West Indies amongst the slave owners and the missionaries is that anybody who resists slavery is anti-God, anti-biblical. I mean, how crazy, can things get? So what I argue is that this sermon is an example of colonial Christianity and how it operates. And it does 3 things. Colonial Christianity buys into racial hierarchy. So it says the gospel of Jesus Christ, soteriology, salvation, legitimates racial hierarchy. It also means that blackness in scripture is a curse. So any attempt to do any kind of interpretive work in terms of the Bible where you legit affirm blackness is problematic because blackness is a curse. And the third area where any form of black resistance becomes problematic, well, they make just black experience, black ontology, black being problematic. What the African Americans call, the African American philosophy terms anti-blackness, what we call in the Caribbean Afrophobia. It's kind of built into the Christian tradition. So you end up with a colonial Christian regime of thought which links these three ideas together. Racial hierarchy in salvation, blackness in scripture is problematic, so you can't even read blackness into scripture in any kind of positive way, and therefore black being, just by virtue of being black, is problematic. African-American scholar Eric Clark calls this third category the double fall. He says black people in the enslaved, in the enslavement and in the modern period live with a double curse. Blackness and the fall from grace. Calls it the double curse. So the question then is, if we accept that that is colonial Christianity, it works with those three areas, well, can we find those ideas then within gospel music? Does gospel music in Britain as a product of the black church then work with these ideas, or does it in any way resist them? So let's look at the influence of colonial Christianity. Whoops. Oh, let's make sure I've got the right one there. Whoops, hold on, let's go back. That's the problem with these apples, you see. You know, the ones they give universities are all dodgy, you see. That's why they give them to us, you know. Right, okay. Right, let's just see, hold on. No, hold on. See if I go back. Hold on, let me see, where am I? Nope, hold on, nope, going forward there. Hold on. Let me try it this way and to go back this way. Hold on. There we go, that's the right one. Yeah, so look, I argue this, that it does have an impact in terms of influencing contemporary Christianity, black Christianity. Colonial Christianity continues, but in muted form, so that gets played out. You end up with a kind of passive radicalism. Colonial Christianity says that salvation is just about the body. The individual can be saved, and racial hierarchy is normative. How do black people respond to that? Well, they respond by saying, well, God saves us individually. Well, there's a kind of radicalism within salvation, but it has no social impact. What we call passive radicalism. It's the work of the first black person in Britain to receive a PhD in black church studies, Valentina Alexander. She invents that category. So this is what the black church does in terms of salvation. It's salvation which is radical for the individual, but it doesn't go beyond the boundaries of the church. It's radical in terms of God saving the individual, but there's no social equivalent. Think about how many times you've seen black church folk on a protest march. We did this once in Birmingham. There was a racial attack in Birmingham in 1995, and we tried to mobilize all the black churches to do something about it. And we held this event at a black church, and there was me who turned up, this other black guy, and a cat. It was a cat that walked in, you know, so we joked about the fact there was three of us because there's a puss who kind of came in. That's awakened really early to the fact that radicalism only went as far as the black body, didn't go beyond that. So we argue that that soteriological category is reconfigured as a form of passive radicalism. Radical in terms of salvation, passive in terms of social impact. Second category then is a spiritualized interpretation. Colonial Christianity says that you can't read blackness into the Bible, only as a curse. So what do black church folk do? Well, rather than contesting that, they spiritualize interpretation. What I mean by that is when they read the Bible, they're not reading it historically. They're not necessarily reading it politically. They're reading it in terms of its spiritual capacity, its transcendence. So therefore, if you read the story of Jesus talking about Jesus talking about the unjust servant, you're going to say, oh, well, the moral of this story is that you should be forgiving to people who have, well, if you read it politically, it's really about how evil people are in the first century because they are jailing, torturing, and enslaving people who can't pay their bills. It's the real point of the story. You know, it's how terrible and unjust the world is. So There's a spiritual approach rather than dealing with the anti-blackness. The third area then we argue is that in response to colonial Christianity's critique of blackness, you end up with that same critique within the same fear, Afrophobia within the black church tradition. How does Afrophobia manifest itself? No attempt to affirm explicitly black life in the context of the church. You might get it now in terms of Black History Month. You might get it occasionally if there's an anniversary or if there's a particular issue at play, but not necessarily as a feature, a regular feature of black life. How do we know that happens? Just go to Barack Obama's church to see how the opposite is played out. I made a film about this 10 years ago for Channel 4 when I was younger and prettier and used to make films for Channel 4. We made a film called God Bless You, Barack Obama. And in the film, we went to Barack Obama's old church. And Barack Obama's old church, you go into the door. You go through the door, it's, when you're driving up there, it's on the south side of Chicago. It's 4 African flags, black nationalist flags on the 4 corners. My goodness. We're going to the right place because, Chicago's got a radical history, Nation of Islam, Wahhabians. You think, my goodness, there's this church with these 4 African flags, black nationalist flags. It's a church. My goodness, that's affirming of black life. You walk into the church. What's the motto of the church? Unapologetically black, unashamedly Christian. My goodness, what is this? Black nationalist camp? No, it's a church. Look in the stained glass window. My goodness, who's that in the stained? It's Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey is Jamaican. Oh my goodness, there's Malcolm X, there's Muslim in it. My goodness, there's Ida B. Wells Barnett. There's Amistad. There's Martin King. They had a stained glass window that was free, and that was for James Cone, but James Cone said he could only put it in there when he was dead. He's dead now, so I presume they put the stained glass. That's an example then of affirming black life in the space. There is no equivalent within the black church within Britain of that kind of iconography. So I argue that what they've done in effect, what we've done is produce an Afrophobia. We don't talk about loving blackness. It becomes problematic. In fact, we went through a period in the 1990s where there were black churches who wouldn't call themselves black. So we're not black, we're just churches. But in churches, well, how do you get to that point? Oh, it's because we're interested in mission. No. It's deeper than that. Because you've been taught in the theology not to affirm black life in explicit ways. It can only be done passively. It can't be done explicitly. Okay, so that's how I argue it continues. How do we prove it then? In the book, I go through a series of historical analyses of gospel music in Britain from the post-war period. I use the work of Steve Alexander Smith, for example, to show how, just to catalogue the kind of black gospel music that's come out of the African Caribbean church and later West African churches within Britain and searching for any sign of coloniality. And look, if you just take a quick glance, the first gospel bands who produced music in the 1960s, early 1970s, the Singing Stewards are the first gospel band ever to perform on British television. It's really interesting how they appear because they appear during the first documentary made on black people in Birmingham. It was called The Colony. And this film was made in 1964. And the Singing Stewards come on, and they sing a song about going to heaven. I want to be ready when Jesus comes. And the program is all about the hardship that Caribbean people are facing in Birmingham in the 1960s. And they're talking about how hard life is. And the Singing Stewards come up. And they're talking about the future hope. Not in any way engaging with the concrete existential reality of being black in Birmingham in 1964. Another group later on, the Overcomers, they produced an album in the late 1960s, 4 songs on the album, every single song about personal salvation, personal piety, the category, the salvific ideas that we find within colonial Christianity, just simply reproduced within the album. 1968, what's happening? King is kicking, they shoot Martin Luther King. Malcolm's dead in 65. The Panthers are out on the streets. The women's liberation movement, the gay liberation movement is taking place. And they're singing about, you're going to go to heaven through the door. You see, there's something missing, isn't there? In terms of an ability to reflect, well, that's the soteriology, the doctrine of salvation that comes out of colonial Christianity. It reduces salvation to the body, isn't concerned about social salvation, what liberation theologians call social sin, the way that evil gets played out in systems, structures, politics. No accounting of that. Let's move on to, look, my mate Enoch Powell comes around. We're from Midlands, you see, so everybody's a friend of Enoch Powell from Wolverhampton, you know what I mean? Wolves. Powell comes along. This is the point I'm making here, is that the overcomers are doing this. Enoch Powell is talking all that racist stuff. Birmingham in 1968, Rivers of Blood. No engagement with it. And that has such a powerful impact on black life in Britain. You know, Powellism leads to Thatcherism. What are we singing about? You can't get to heaven but through the door. All good gifts around us. No way engaging. A limited soteriology that fails to engage with the world out there. In the book, I talk about how when I was going to church in the 1970s, we used to go over to Birmingham, and the irony was that one year, I start one of the chapters in the book about this, how one year there was a march by the National Front, and all we could do in our church van, because we kind of ended up at this kind of junction, there's National Front people all around us in the church van. So what do? We raised the chorus. So we all started singing the Andre Crouch song. Soon and very soon we're going to see the King, which is kind of ironic because maybe they're going to kill us and we're going to see the King, very quickly. But all we could do was raise the chorus. But the irony was that at the same time that we were doing that, literally a stone's throw away, you had reggae bands in Birmingham who were talking about doing in the National Front. Steel Pulse, 78, Steel Pulse's song, Ku Klux Klan. What does it say? Do unto the clan as they would unto you. In this case, hate thy neighbor. Those cowards only kill who they fear. That's why they hide behind those hoods and cloaks. The Rastas were saying, let's do them in. We were saying, let's look to heaven. I'm not saying transcendence doesn't have a role to play in terms of empowerment, but in this scheme of thinking, it's deeply connected to colonial soteriology. Your body is all that can be saved because you can't be saved in the social world. Because remember, the conundrum of colonial Christianity is that you can save black bodies, but you can't free them. That tension is retained in the music. And then look, you get Maggie. Maggie Thatcher comes along. Margaret Thatcher introduced a neoliberal economics informed by the Chicago School of Economics. Personal endeavor will lead to benefit. And I argue that what happens with black church music here is quite significant. I argue Thatcher exposes a real deep conservatism within the black church. Black churches, if you take out the religion, are really quite close to the Conservative Party. It's only because of racism that we've had to be socially liberal. We're quite, morally quite conservative in terms of behavior, but liberal in terms of voting because of racism. And I think what Thatcher does is just really expose this conservatism within the black church. I use the example of one of the greatest gospel bands ever in Britain, and of that period as well, Paradise. Paradise have a song called Success, where they have they tell this song about somebody who's unemployed, mass unemployment, out there doing nothing. Life is kind of difficult. Actually, it's not that album, it's a different cover album, not that one where they sing the song Success. But the point I make is that Thatcherism exposes this conservatism, and the bands sing songs that are actually quite close to conservative values. Success comes with righteousness. Well, that's a reconfiguration of the Protestant work ethic. It's a black church Protestant work ethic. Work hard, you'll get your individual reward. Well, hold on a minute. Thatcher's kicking black people out of their jobs, destroying industries. Got this stop and search gig going on, which Brixton kicks off. What are we singing about? Success comes with, we're dealing with Thatcher here. It gets out, and I argue the same thing happens with LCGC. Don't get me wrong, I love these artists. I grew up on these artists. I love listening to their work. But then you start thinking, hold on a minute, 84, we've had the riots, but even Birmingham kicks off. It's a lot to get the Brummies kicking off in terms of rioting. Liverpool, get the Scousers at Bristol. My goodness, everything's kicking off. What does Thatcher do? Thatcher then handpicks black people who are succeeding in business to act as examples of how black people can succeed in life. So how does black music respond to that? Does it side with the kids who are unemployed on the streets, who are asking questions about state violence? No, instead, we sing songs that I argue buy into Thatcherism. And I play with this idea of what LCGC do with this song called Fill My Cup, because the song is about, on one level, being filled with the Spirit. But in the spirit of the age, where everything is about abundance, it's a bit tricky. It could equally apply to, well, give me more of everything that there is out there, not just the Spirit. I'll play a little bit of them doing their thing. So I mean, what I'm saying is, in an age where we're running from fascists, you know, I'm on the streets in the 1980s. You know, in 1984, when I was going to school, so I used to do 400 meters. 400 meters from my classroom door to the end of the school gate, you know, and it was good training because you had to get out fast before the fascists ended up at the school gate, so the kids were going to beat up in school. So all of that stuff is kicking off. And what are we singing about? We want more of the spirit. We want more of the good life. You know, Thatcher's just deregulated the city of London, and everybody's talking about abundance. So what does the song do? Buy into the abundance. There's nobody talking about Blair Peach being killed. Nobody's talking about Brixton going up in smoke. Nobody's talking about the Brummies imitating Brixton. You know, so again, you know, what's this an example of? The way in which colonial Christian thought reduces salvation again to the body, to the person, has nothing to say about social salvation. And let's move on. So we can move into the 1990s is a disaster because all we have is the main genre is crossover music. You know, crossover music is lyrically ambiguous music, so you can be singing about the disco, but it could be really that you're singing about God, you know, so you can look at the work of Brian Powell, for example, buys into this. Not so much Raymond and Co. comes along a little bit later, but there are other gospel artists. I think the group that I use, I can't remember the group I use in the book, but crossover basically is lyrically ambiguous. You can't work out whether they're talking about God or talking about the disco. The idea of doing it is mission. They're inspired by the African Americans who are doing this, BB and CC, but you've got no engagement with one of the biggest events of the 1990s. Tragic murder of Stephen Lawrence. Left all black communities in a state of trauma. Left black people wondering about, are our kids safe? What kind of racial, the spectre of racial terror. And look, and the lyrics are dealing with crossover. Lyrically ambiguous, not even attempting to engage in any way, shape or form. That doesn't mean that gospel artists didn't work with the Lawrence family. There were black church folk who supported the Lawrence family's campaign, did a lot of work in terms of fundraising, you know, so they weren't completely out of it. But the music, again, fails to engage, fails to register any kind of meaningful connection. It gets slightly better in the noughties, partly because of the continuity of racialized oppression. We end up with gang and gun culture. We come out of the Blair Brown era and enter an age of austerity. And it's very difficult if you're in the black church tradition to avoid what's happening in the community. When I was living in Handsworth in Birmingham in the 1990s, every Sunday we did prison ministry. Because there's just so many young people in the church and the community caught up with crime. So you just couldn't avoid it. People are going in that because of the way in which the police had criminalized large quadrants of the black community. So you couldn't avoid this stuff. But what's interesting is the artists who then come out of this period, especially those informed by hip hop cultures, what they do is quite significant. They acknowledge the issues. So they say, look, there's a problem. That's a big step. They're actually saying there's a problem out there with the social injustice. But their diagnosis is the same as colonial Christianity. What do you do then? You don't educate the kids. You don't organize against the system. Instead, you do personal piety. You get more of Jesus. So a good example of that is Jahazel's song, In My Neighborhood, where he talks about everything that's kicking off. But the solution to it isn't organizing, isn't resistance, it's we need more of Jesus.
Yeshua said, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and strength. And the second greatest command is like unto it, love thy neighbor as thyself, yeah. Tired of the shots firing, it's time to fight back with love. Listen, every day another gun gets manufactured, another man's blasted, and some blame gangster rappers. I ain't trying to say gangster rap's the problem, but it don't solve enough, just keeps it revolving, and nothing won't change unless we change. If you wanna see change, then be changed, and rearrange your full pattern towards action. Cause if we do nothing, then nothing's what's gonna happen. As for this thing we call rapping, time to use it in its true power and give the youth power. Death and life is found in the power of the tongue, and it's not in the barrel of a gun. I'm shocked at how it has become. Every coward got a gun, they let it shower in the slum. Young soldiers blame for gun culture. They the ones dying, who's flying the guns over. It ain't the way that I would wish it, but it's just the way it is.
Yeah, I'll cut that there in terms of time. But you see, the analysis is there, but the solution, more personal salvation, more colonial Christianity. That's what's required to solve the predicament. Jehazel's quite interesting because he then, a few years later, renounces his Christian faith, gets into Afrocentric religion, and moves away from Christianity for those same reasons. He's now, I think it's in the last year now of a degree course at Birmingham City University in Black Studies, and he features in the book. I have a dialogue with him in the book. I got him on the degree course, you see, so I'm in his good books at the moment. So right, so how do we then decolonize this? How do we, if we accept then, we've got this thing called colonial Christianity. It's got a limited soteriology. It's got an interpretive scheme that problematizes black people. It does in black bodies. It's anti-black in terms of its ontology. And this is nothing revolutionary. You know, if you read black philosophy, you go back to the work of Frantz Fanon, the 1940s, 1950s, the idea of blackness as the opposite of whiteness in terms of ontologies played out there. So then how do we decolonize this? How do we then find options? We're thinking about decoloniality in the work of Walter Mignola and others in Latin America. We have to then delink from it and find alternative options. And so what I do in terms of finding the options, my options are social soteriology. I want an understanding of salvation that is concerned with every aspect of human existence. I want black interpretation to resist the anti-black interpretation of colonialism. And rather than having a negative black ontology, I want to affirm loving blackness as part of the Christian tradition. And these are all played out in this conceptual album that I developed with the music producer Tony Bean and a host of other black artists in Birmingham, called the Jamaican Bible Remix. Why is it called the Jamaican Bible Remix? Because the Bible Society funded it. They're the only ones who give us the money, basically. So I went to them and said, nobody's reading the Jamaican New Testament because people can't understand it, because when you have a spoken language that becomes a written language, it takes a while for people to understand it. So what would happen, maybe one way in which we could promote this text is if we set it to music. Now that's right out of the Bible Society's comfort zone. They're not allowed to do that, but they did it. So they gave us half of the money, and the other half of the money we found from other places to do it. And what we do is we sample audio. And this is quite significant because the Jamaican Bible is an example of decolonial interpretation. So straight away, the middle category of interpreting the Bible and affirming blackness, it's done within this version. I made a radio program on this for BBC World Service 2018 called the Jamaican Bible Remixed, where we met all of the scholars at the universities across the West Indies who translated this version, because it's quite technical in terms of the Hebrew and the language and everything, you know, and using Jamaican patois to translate it. It's quite complex. So they see it as black interpretation. So just sampling this just means that we're fulfilling the middle concern. I'll just a bit of the Jamaican New Testament if you've not heard it before.
All I know say you need God in every way. God bless you. Cause the good thing them when God give, when him rule people life in every way, uno go get them. All I want ball now, God bless them. Cause the time I go come when God I go push them and make them happy again. All I want humble themselves, God bless them. Cause you see the earth, and them people there I go come get it. Who want the way right in a God here is so bad that it coming like say I'm dead, them are dead for hungry.
That's the Beatitudes. So that's the Beatitudes being read there from Matthew in the Jamaican New Testament. So what we did was we said, well, look, let's sample the audio and then tell stories around them, like you would do in terms of gospel. But let's make the notion of salvation engage with the social world. We've got the black interpretation there, but let's try and do things that then affirm black being. So to end with, I'm just going to show you two songs from the album that attempt to do these two things. The first one is an example of social soteriology. It's called Incarnation, No Blacks, No Dogs, No Irish. What we do here is we juxtapose the radical idea of the incarnation. Incarnation in liberation theology is a statement about equality. God being able to dwell in all flesh means all flesh is good. So we juxtapose that with the post-war experience, the mythological, because nobody's ever found a window which says no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. Nobody's ever found that. Saying, I'm still looking for it. But it was there. People talked about no blacks and no Irish, but nobody's seen that. But anyway, we won't go into that. But the point is, we juxtapose that to try and resolve it. How do we resolve this history then? And look what we're doing. We're connecting salvation to the social world. The lyrics of the song tell a fictional account of a colonial citizen, because they weren't migrants, they were colonial citizens, coming from the Caribbean and experiencing this hostility. We got a guy called what's his name? Not Singing D. There's one black singer in Birmingham who's the most famous backing singer in all of the world. And he'd just literally been backing like Ollie Murs in Japan. And he gave us like one session. So it's a bit croaky because he said, I can only give you one session, then get on the plane. Darren Ellison. Darren Ellison? Anyway, it's a backing singer. He left the church ages ago because he realized he could be a rock star just singing behind Michael Jackson and all these other people. So we can't talk about Michael Jackson. Singing behind, all these Aretha Franklin and other people. So he came in, did this for us. And then we thought, well, how do we represent, this is 2017 when we did this. How do we then think about the incarnation today? Where are black bodies being threatened? Where's what sociologists call the propensity for premature death being played out? Well, it's in deaths in custody. So what we thought we'd do is have a collage of images that then talk about the contemporary struggle to back up the lyricism which deals with the 1950s. The sample, though, that you'll hear, the Jamaican New Testament, is from John 1:14, the Incarnation. On the music, we were trying to play with Junior Giscombe's style of music, but I don't know how well we kind of pulled that off.
In 1954, about 10,000 West Indians came to Britain. In 1955, it is believed another 15,000 will make the long journey. Already their coming has caused a national controversy, but one point must always be borne in mind. Whatever our feelings, we cannot deny the mention. For all are British citizens, and as such, are entitled to the identical rights of any member of the Empire.
John chapter 1. No, the one where the word. John man, him come live amongst we. Come live amongst we. No, the one where the word. John man, him come live amongst we.
John 1:14 tells the story of Jesus' incarnation, that the Word becomes flesh and lives amongst us. It means that God, who is fully God and fully man, takes on human form. The incarnation means that unequivocally all creation is good, and that all flesh, no matter what color, no matter what tone, is good. My parents believed in this meaning of the incarnation, that their flesh was good. They were immigrants from Jamaica who came to work in Britain after the Second World War. But they soon came to realize that not everybody thought the same. When they went to look for places to live, they were greeted with signs that said, "No blacks, no Irish, and no dogs."
5,000 miles with the sun way up behind me. The stage is gonna be a while till I feel that warm again. Staring at the gray skies as the cold wind starts to soak me. Faces that I recognize, but no one I call a friend. Just one place about how my father served before me. Still no wise about the days that lay ahead. possibility of a better life instead. Maybe if you give me time just to let me tell my story, and how I came to be in the land of hope and glory. Moment that I touch the ground, all I see is consternation. You never let me explain that I'm here by invitation. Came expecting arms to hold and wide. No legs, no Irish and no dogs inside. The sign is plain and you don't try to hide. No legs, no Irish and no dogs inside.
Much of the outcry against the influence arises from the colour bar, which legally does not exist in Britain. Does not exist in Britain.
Him come live monks week. Come live monks week.
5 years, 3 days to go till I get back to my family. Gotta find a place to stay with the people playing games. There's a lot of empty rooms. I know I've got the money. Money on the currency doesn't seem to be the same. Working from 5 to 5 and the guys are always hungry. Gotta fight to stay alive, never figured in the plans. Try to find a house to God, only made the people angry. Sad to realize that I'm seen as less than just a man. Maybe if you give me time just to let me tell my story, well, how I came to be in the land of hope and glory. Moment that I touch the ground, all I see is consternation. You never let me explain that I'm here by invitation.
The strange thing is that in church history, the brilliant minds of the church have spent a great deal of time trying to explain the doctrine of the incarnation, that Jesus had to be fully God and had to be fully man, and use that as a way of countering heresy. But less time has been spent on the meaning of the incarnation and what it means to practice the equality of all humanity. If the church had spent more time on the meaning and the practice of the incarnation, we wouldn't have this terrible post-war story. No blacks, no Irish, and no dogs.
Came expecting arms to hold and wide. No legs, no Irish and no dogs inside. The sign is plain and you don't try to hide. No legs, no Irish and no dogs inside. God is not dead, he's still alive. God is not dead, he's still alive. I can feel him in my hands, I can feel him in my feet, I can feel him all over, moving all over me. God is not dead, he's still alive. God is not dead, he's still alive. I can feel him in my feet, I can feel him all over me.
You're always home with the kids. Makes everybody happy, home with the babies. There's lots of signifiers there that you wouldn't necessarily be aware of, but Kingsley Burrell, who was killed by police, we know he was killed by police because police got prosecuted in the end in that trial in Birmingham. Kingsley Burrell's cousin is one of the rappers that we have on the album who does some stuff on this for us. You hear him at the end of that. So there's lots of signifiers that register in terms of Birmingham. I'm going to play one more and then end. Okay, the third category that I mentioned was about loving blackness as a way of resisting the negative ontology that emerges out of colonial Christianity. So one of the songs on the album is called Resurrection Revolution. What we do here is think about the resurrection as a revolutionary moment, but then think about what that revolutionary moment means in terms of loving blackness. So the sample comes from the story of the resurrection in the book of Luke. That's what you hear in terms of the Jamaican New Testament. We just let that play out as verses and chorus. But if you listen to the chorus, we actually talk about the resurrection in relation to pollution, climate justice, in relation to gang violence, in relation to domestic violence, and in relation to political violence in the world. So there's a lot of playing with what the resurrection means. But we wanted then to have a visual that just showed black people loving other black people, because that is just always been problematized in terms of the Western imagination. Just think in terms of television adverts, how rarely you see black people in any kind of intimate relationship with any other black person. I want to pitch the film with Kwame Kwema to Channel 4, and they were really up for it. You know, it was a detective story. We made it for radio in the end, but it was a really, really good detective story. And they said, we really love it. You know, we're going to put the money into it. Fantastic. You know, I was thinking, my goodness, make some money out of this. And they said, but the only problem is the relationship between the two people. I said, well, what's wrong? They said, well, look, we have, an audience in Britain hasn't been cultivated to watch a 9 o'clock program on Channel 4 with two black people in a loving relationship. So I said, well, what are we going to do about it? We'll break them up. I said, no. They said, so why don't you make his wife white? And that way, it will work. So I thought, well, that would kill the drama. But Kwame, I thought, forget this. But Kwame was very sophisticated, Kwame Kwema. Kwame said, look, what you need really is, she doesn't need to be white, she just needs to be aspirational. And I said, yeah, that's it. So we managed to, in the end, talk them out of not being a black person. But in the end, I said, look, it has to be this way or no way. So in the end, we didn't get the deal. Never worked with Kwame again, unfortunately. So, one of those things. But anyway, so this is an attempt to rectify that by at least trying to do it with gospel music and thinking then about the resurrection as affirming black love. Oops, nope, that isn't the right one. Let's try again. Here we go. I'll just play a few minutes of this and then we're finished.
Luke chapter 24.
But I go look for the one where I live. Once the one they were dead. Him not there. Him come back alive. Him come back alive.
Resurrection, revolution, Christ is risen, sin unchained done, Satan can't win. Christ is risen, Christ is risen. Resurrection, revolution, Christ is risen, sin unchained done, Satan can't win. Christ is risen, Christ is risen.
After they come back from the tomb, the woman then tell Jesus the 11 apostles, and all the rest of followers them, what did happen? No, I did Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary we are James' mother, and the other woman them, who did tell the apostles them why them sick. But the apostles them never believed the woman them, because when them did say, sound like foolish.
Resurrection, revolution, Christ is risen, gonna get done, no vexation, immigration, Christ is risen. Revolution, Christ is risen, gonna get done, no vexation, immigration.
I think there are some few images of African and black families in the media because their erasure serves a particular purpose. It serves the continued notion that our families are pathological, that our families are broken, that our families require healing, and that as such, we're such a problem that we can't be depicted as normal. When in fact, we are just as normal and just as beautiful as all of the families from all of the ethnicities. Research continues to show that although some of our families do have single parent family structures, black families are not just defined by absent fatherhood. In fact, Caribbean fathers in particular are very likely to be in their children's lives, taking part in children's activities, meeting up with families, taking care of their children in a way that is often never represented in the media.
Him bend down. But the only thing him see are the piece of linen cloth one. So him go away. I wonder what
Resurrection, revolution, Christ is risen, evolution, Palestinian, peace solution, Christ is risen. Resurrection, revolution, Christ is risen, evolution, Palestinian, peace solution, Christ is risen. Up from the grave, he
Like gospel music folk will know, we're playing there with choruses as well from the church and weaving them into the narrative as well. And that song is quite, the images in there, we tried to be as inclusive as possible, so you can't necessarily show this one. Some of the Pentecostal churches, people get a bit upset with the images of inclusion, but we wanted to push that point as well. So there were a couple of others. If I had time, I would have shown them to you, but thank you. Thank you. That's the end of the talk. I think I'm happy to field some questions. I think we've got a bit of time. We've got to, was it to 8:30? Is it? Sure. I'm happy to field questions because I think the football's back on at 9, isn't it? So I'm just joking, isn't it? I'm just joking. It's all done now. Go ahead. Any questions? Yep, sure. Go ahead. Yep.
Thank you for the talk. It's really, and you have such amazing energy. And I want to ask about, like, at the beginning you talked about there's like an appetite in the theology study, and I wonder whether like the colonial Christianity is so embedded in your community that like the Christian community in the UK is so separated between black and white.
Yeah.
Is it the case now, and how do you see the future development?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think you're spot on. I think that colonial Christianity has two sides to it. There is not only how it impacts black, Caribbean, African churches, but also in terms of its continued influence in terms of whiteness. And so there is an impasse. And it starts with Christian theology. Christian theology is an apartheid discipline. And why do I say that? For 3 reasons. Number one, in terms of where the students are. Majority of the students are black students in one institution. The other institutions don't have as many black students. They just don't go to those institutions. Why? Because in Britain, there are 1,000 people teaching theology in Britain, England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales. 1,000 people teaching, part-time, full-time researchers. Out of that 1,000, there are only 2.5 black people teaching Christian theology. David Muir at Roehampton, Anthony Reddy at Oxford is only part-time, and there's an African New Testament scholar at the university. 2.5 people in the whole, and that's in a discipline where the majority of the people filling the pews disproportionately are black and brown people. Deeply problematic. Why is it an apartheid discipline? Because it has an impact then in terms of output. One of my party pieces when I used to teach this was to say to students, go and find every book you can find in the library written by Christian theologians racialized as white since Windrush. They come back and say 2. John Wilkinson, 1994, Ken Leach before that, 75 years. White scholars in theology have only produced 2 books reflecting. There's a third one, but it's a fascist book. It's by Dan Bigger, the Oxford professor of ethics, who believes that slavery was humane and that it's right for one ethnic group to dominate another ethnic group. I debated him a month ago on Beyond Belief. Listen to him. He says slavery was humane. What are you talking about? What are you so upset about? It's not Oxford ethicist, teaches pastoral studies, training people to, it's amazing stuff. So then I say to them, go out and find amongst the same demographic, how many books were written since Windrush on being nice to animals? Why? Because animal theology is a big thing in the Northern Hemisphere. People believe animals have got souls, going to see them at dog. I've got nothing wrong with it. I hope, the rabbit that the dog ate when I was 6, I hope it makes it to heaven. I'd like to be reunited with it. But they come back and they say, there are over 80 books. So British theology invests more time thinking about animals than dealing with the 500-year history of racial terror. So it's an apartheid discipline because of where the students are, because of the numbers of people teaching within it, and then what they produce. And that then spills out into church life, because you then end up with no thinking around inclusion. The thinking around inclusion doesn't take place on Sunday morning, it takes place on Saturday night. Paul Gilroy wrote about that in the 1990s, One Nation Under a Groove. Saturday night when people get, that's much more multicultural. The DJ is doing more work on inclusion than the preacher. So yes, I think the future of it, is bleak. To be honest, I don't see any changes taking place with West African churches. Incredibly entrepreneurial, incredibly transatlantic, incredibly confident, and therefore they don't actually need the inclusion to prove that God is working amongst them. So I think you might get some, and then where you do find congregations that are highly mixed, you end up with the black people doing a two-pack. Tupac song, has Heaven Got a Ghetto, which is really about the divisions of black labor within Christianity. Well, you go to made a film about this in 2016 for BBC One called The Battle for Christianity. All of the mixed churches went to black people doing old music. Well, I'm not saying that they should. They weren't doing the educational stuff. They weren't doing the financial stuff. They were doing the music. So it was reinscribing a racial trope. What black people do in the church, they do the singing and dancing and music. So even within those mainstream churches, and if you read Ben Lindsay's book about racism and evangelicalism, it's deeply problematic. What the Americans call the original sin of the nation, racism, apartheid, genocide. We've got our own original sin, which is colonial Christianity, but the church is no way along the line attempting to exorcise it. Not Anglican Church, be more specific, the Quakers have offered to pay reparation for their role in the transatlantic slave trade, but the Quakers, it takes them 100 years to make any decision. So don't expect anything for another 100. We'll be dead by the time they, pay up. The Anglican Church is slowly acknowledging this past, but doing everything to suppress its impact. The Anglican Church ran a slave plantation in Barbados for 130 years. You won't find it written in the history books. We made a two-parter about it on BBC World Service. People were shocked. They branded women's breasts with the sign of the fish. That's not going to appear in church history courses. So it's a whole whack of work to be done on this. So I'm not particularly optimistic. I'm a black pessimist when it comes to thinking about the power of the gospel to unite people in that way. Why? Because there's so much invested in whiteness and keeping Jesus white. Once you actually disinvest in that, you've got to be like Jesus and treat everybody equally. And that takes away a lot of power from a lot of people who aren't necessarily ready to give it up. So I'm sorry, there's no Hollywood ending in it for me just yet. I think it's going to be years of struggle before we actually acknowledge that, because at the heart of it, the film that we made earlier this year, after the flood, we said the heart of it is pay back what you stole. And the charity who inherited the plantation won't even speak to us. No, we even sent nice people to speak to them and say, look, didn't want to know, not willing to open their archives, spent 140 years torturing, brutalizing, terrorizing black people, lived off the profits, not willing to talk about it in 2022. They even told a little lie on their website. They said, we paid reparations in 1880 something. When you go back in the history books, they just help redevelop some of the land. It's not reparations. So it's deeply problematic. In fact, I argue that Christianity's sojourn with racial terror is a form of occult practice. And therefore, what's actually necessary is exorcism. It's not rational. Can't reason with this. It's deeply spiritual. You have to exercise it. And that's not radical. Bob Marley sung about it in the 80s. Babylon's system is a vampire, building church and university, deceiving the people. You smoke weed, you come up with these solutions. You need a PhD to come up with these solutions. The Chronicle do it for you. Bob Marley understood that the ideological investment that there is in whiteness and Christianity and how it's evil. Babylon system, remember vampire imagery in the Caribbean is deeply related to colonialism. We have a word in Jamaica, nyam. It's not got an African root. It's got no root in Europe. Enslaved people made it up to describe what slavery did to them. Nyam is complete and utter devouring. What they're doing, they're nyamming us out. eating us out. In Haiti, enslaved people created in their religion an image of what it did to them. The zombie. Zombies got nothing to do with Hollywood or people shooting people up on the street. The zombie is what it means to be an enslaved person. A mindless body. Left that in the memory for us to understand what they were going through. So unless we resolve that history, not one course teaches it, Christian theology in the UK. It's deeply problematic. So I don't teach theology anymore. I work in the green environment, so it's sustainability. So I can throw these bombs in there and not have to worry about it. So we'll take a couple more. I think the gallery said there's like £70 per question that's asked. When you leave, you get it at the door. It's cash, paying cash, yeah, cash. You can pay they've got a card reader in reverse to put your card on it, you get £70. We'll take a couple more and then we'll aim to finish. It's 5 minutes. I think 8:30 was the time we were roughly scheduled to finish, but go ahead. Yeah, sure.
I suppose I'm just interested in your thoughts about, for example, Black British gospel music. You see it in a lot of very kind of prestigious places. For example, I'm thinking Royal Wedding.
Yeah.
And it's as you said, like seen as very joyful and happy and quite something sanitized that can be performed to a predominantly white audience.
Yep.
And I just wondered, like, what you think about, for example, the idea of complicity in terms of if it like black people who are kind of leading.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I'd frame. I think it's a brilliant question. I'd put it in two ways. The Royal Wedding was brilliant because what the Kingdom Choir do is actually quite subversive because it's crossover, but a different kind of crossover. There's crossover where you're which is lyrically ambiguous. They appropriate a secular song and reversion it, and by doing that, Karen probably didn't think she was doing this, but they weave the sacred and the secular in together, which resists colonial Christianity. And I have that in the book. I use what the Kingdom Choir do at the Royal Wedding as an example of how to rethink the sacred and the profane in black life, because they bring them together. And that's an African tradition. In Africa, there's no word for religion. West African, there's no word, because religion is all of life. And within West African religion, the sacred and the profane are all mixed together. That's why you have some deities which are dodgy. Some of them are deities, and they're doing people in. Well, that happens in the Old Testament as well, doesn't it? But you know what I mean? But so what they do is actually quite radical. Plus, what's radical about the Royal Wedding is, the black people who are there. And look what they're doing. You've got black preaching. Look what Reverend Curry does. Appropriates the African-American spirituals. Talk about the slaves. The Daily Mail got upset about that. He talked about the slaves in the chapter. Radical stuff. And then look at Rose Hudson Wilkin goes there with her Jamaican lilt. He's trying to hold down the patois. It was radical. So I talk about how that is an example of black orality at its best. The preaching, the singing, the teaching. And I argue all of those three elements I craft into techniques for doing decolonized gospel music. So I use that. So what I'm saying is it's complex. There's an example of subversion. However, in some previous work that I've done I chart the way in which black Christians are represented on television. And I'm more critical then in terms of some of the ways in which black people used to turn up in the 1990s, like with comedians singing in the background. Do you remember, what's his name, the comedian now, he died. There's a comedian who used to have these big hands, do a black church. There were black folks singing in the background. And there were telecommunications adverts and black folks singing in the background. So I just ask critical questions. Well, what does our positioning there suggest? Well, it's commercial, because ultimately it's a business. People got to live, people got to eat. But then that's soulful gospel music. It's not the soul of the gospel, and that's what I'm trying to do. Now, it's not a case of either or. I think that you can have both. Is there complicity? Yes, because I think that soulful music is complicit. It's complicit with the status quo, and that's not what the soul of the gospel is about. Soul of the gospel is disruption, challenge, overturning, resisting, doing the opposite. And that's the challenge. The challenge is how we move them, how we get more of the music into that other There are examples of it. 1990s Sounds of Blackness, created an album which was appropriated African traditions, rewrote, Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit appears on a gospel album, song about lynching. You know, on a gospel album. So there are places where people have done this. There are some contemporary examples as well that some of the students talk about where some gospel artists are attempting to do this, but not necessarily within the British context. S.O., the gospel artist who was based here, goes over to America and produces a song about white Jesus. But the prognosis is still the same. You know, we've got the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, blah, 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 blah. It's not going to change anything. Well, hold on. You just said there's this misrepresentation. Surely the song should end with you saying, let's paint them all black now. Let's change it. No, just want more of the spirit. See, so again, not going complicit with it, not moving on to the kind of social consideration. So it's complex in that way. And what I'm calling for, and you know, if I had time, I could have shown an example where I think, you know, the Kingdom Choir do this in the modern world. There is an example where I collaborated with Karen, who's here, at COP26, and the Kingdom Choir reversioned the only song ever written by a soul artist about environmental degradation. Marvin Gaye's Mercy, Mercy Me, the Ecology. There is Michael Jackson's Earth Song. We can't talk about Michael Jackson, so I have to leave that one behind. But so we're going to talk about Marvin Gaye. And here they are, you know, so this is COP26. You've got all the world leaders there trying to reach a solution. COP26 was actually better than COP27 by the looks of things. And then Karen Gibson and the Kingdom Choir are there in Glasgow Cathedral. And what are they doing? They're taking a song that deals with environmental destruction and bringing it into the church. And again, playing with this idea that the sacred and the secular are separate. They're not separate in the Hebrew Bible tradition, but weaving them in together to create a space for then projecting the gospel out into the social world and get engaging. The recording isn't. Oops! Oh, sorry. Oh dear. Hold on. I was just clued it up in the right place as well. There. Sorry about that. There we go. There we go. They're just getting ready there. It takes you a while to get ready, doesn't it, Karen? You know, and I think it was me that day helping you sort it out, wasn't it? I was saying no. No. Here you go. The volume isn't great on this though, but
Ain't what they used to be. No, where did all the blue skies go? Oh, the wind that blows from the trumpet sound. Oh, mercy, mercy me. Wow. Oh, things ain't what they used to be. Oh.
So you see, there's an example. You see, that's on the Glasgow Cathedral website if you want to watch that. But there's an example, you see, of how a particular form of crossover can do that kind of soteriological work where it engages with the social world, but it's highly commercialized. And I recognize that in a commercial marketplace, you know, songs like, you know, Incarnation ain't really going to make number one, are they? You know, they're not going to play it on any radio station, you know, but this kind of thing you can do. And this may be the way forward. Thinking about creative crossover music that hits those buttons, but deals with songs that talk about real hardcore issues in the social world. So it's complicated. There is evidence of complicity, but there are forms of resistance. And but I'm trying to push it out even further and call for, you know, what Valentina Alexander calls active radicalism, where you're engaging with these deep existential questions that people are facing. Look, it's not rocket science. Happens in drill. Happens in trap, happens in grime. You know, that they're doing this kind of work, you know, all the time. Asking, read Monique Childs' PhD at University of Warwick on the spirituality of grime. Looking at how grime artists deal with these existential questions. If you want something a bit more highbrow, African-American philosophers at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton have all written a book that costs £140 on Kendrick Lamar. You know, I mean, you know, obviously, you know, trying to make money out of Kendrick, aren't they? You know what I mean? But looking at Kendrick Lamar's existential wrestling, his theological ideas, his black humanism. So it's being done in all these other, Kendrick Lamar claims to be a Christian. It's being done in these others, so why can't we do it? So it's not beyond the boundaries of black musicality. It's not beyond the boundaries of black spirituality. It's a commercial issue, primarily commercial, but also two other things. It's about moral courage. You've got to be willing to take the leap to do this kind of thing, and that's dangerous, sticking your head above the parapet. And it takes a certain kind of skill set in terms of understanding how these theological ideas work as well.
Would you also argue that there needs to be a degree of consciousness amongst those who are, amongst the scene, the community that there is? It takes courage, but if there's no consciousness, that doesn't impact.
I think you're right. I think you're right. The consciousness is there.
There isn't.
Yes, I think you. Yes. Yep. Yep.
I mean, the complacency, the way in which they
understand
what they're doing, the strategy, the ideas.
Yep. I think yes.
So there has to be a revolution or an awakening within the church churches for that to be fully embraced and understood.
Yes.
And I think we're finding it now with some of the young Black lives matters, all these other, is causing an inward reflection. I think in some of the Black churches anyway. Even these ministers who would be careful about, mentioning racism or now understanding it's necessary.
I think you're right. I think you're right. It is about transforming the consciousness, and if you have a negative ontology, a negative view of being Black, double fall, it's difficult to build that kind of consciousness. But what does intrigue me, this is the other side of it, in the 1990s, there was a church that I went to, again, in Handsworth in Birmingham. We had some really radical musicians. These guys were playing, there's a guy who was playing keyboards, used to play with Steel Pulse, the reggae band, the gig. He'd be gigging with Steel Pulse on a Saturday night doing reggae, then he'd come in church and be playing on, had to be prayed up, once he got to church. My goodness, where you last night? Oh, Pastor, I was at the club, till 3 o'clock in the morning, and they were smoking ganja, and it's still on my clothes. Pastor, no, you have to take that off. Can't wear it, so there were people who were exposed to that consciousness, but then they came back into the church and they played the same music. Occasionally they try to subvert it. You get a little bit of Michael Jackson being played in the riff or whatever, do a little bit of subversion in terms of music. And I thought, why weren't they able to? Because I argue in the book, the songs are deeply ideological. They hail you, to quote Althusser. The songs always bring you back to coloniality. And I'll give you an example of that. The 1950s, 58, Kelso Cochrane is killed in London. First major racial attack in Ladbroke Grove. Tragedy. Whole of the nation is in shock. They call it a race riot, because Teddy Boy's attacking Black people. It's a great Jamaican story there, because the Ladbroke Grove people are mainly from the smaller islands, calling the Jamaicans from Brixton. Jamaicans come down and sort everybody out, so there's never any trouble after the Jamaicans turn up, you see. Jamaicans like to talk about those kind of stories anyway. But it happens, and then straight afterwards, 58, all these Black organisations are formed, what becomes the Nottingham Carnival, campaign against racial discrimination. This looks like a plethora, hundreds, thousands of Black organisations, including the first Black churches, are developing out of that. So why don't this radical revolutionary moment, these Black organisations are then looking to African-American literature, they're looking to Pan-African literature, they're drawing on the emergence of Afrocentric material to conscientise them. What is the Black church resourcing itself with in this radical moment? Jim Reeves, Pat Boone, if you don't know them, evangelical American artist. They're resourcing them with the Moodian Sankey hymnal, conservative songs, resourcing themselves with the fledgling Caribbean gospel music scene. The Consolers, Joseph Niles and the Consolers and others, So the music, I argue, actually holds them back. And that's why it's deeply problematic. This revolutionary moment, everybody's kicking off, 58, 59, 60, it's all happening in terms of the Black. 62, you end up with the first, 65, isn't it? The first immigration legislation, everything's kicking off. The Black church forms, recognises that things need to change. But the music then constrains them, has an ideological role. And that's why it's actually can be incredibly powerful or deeply problematic.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was no tradition for songwriting to express that. If I was to draw your attention to America, Thomas Dorsey spent many years on the road in the clubs. He brought his influence and his music into the church.
Yeah.
And he influenced what was said, social conditions that were going on. So if you look at some of his lyrics, his words, he was conscious of the Jim Crow experiences and what was happening there. But we kind of just go on with the work of saving souls? I think you're absolutely right when you say that. But there has to be a consciousness amongst those that are in the music industry to start to write and to express those things.
Yeah. Oh yeah, completely. But Tommy Dorsey doesn't get off the hook, because what Tommy Dorsey does is problematic for some musicologists, because he reframes gospel music an urban, individualistic, capitalist environment. What are the spirituals doing? The spirituals are rural, communal, social. And that's why the spirituals have a lot more to say about the world around them and collectivity and collective action, and also signifying revolution. Look, Go Down Moses isn't about Exodus, it's about getting off the plantation. Wade in the water has got nothing to do with baptism. Wade in the water is a description of how to escape the Jim Crow South and get into the North. That's what it starts talking about, stars in the skies. And it's about how you follow the star and you'll end up to freedom. So there's a deeply subversive, they can contain the soul of the gospel. What Tommy Dorsey then does is bring in, the fusion between the spirituals and the blues, creates this whole new genre that becomes gospel, but it retreats back from the revolutionary work of the spirituals. It raises its head in the 1950s. Mahalia Jackson, a couple of other people, occasionally you'll get something that bucks the trend. But generally, Tommy Dorsey does the work of maintaining some of these ideas rather than resisting them. The person to read on this is Aubrey Hendricks. Aubrey Hendricks has a book called he has an essay called "I Am Your Spiritual Dope Dealer," which was a phrase used by what's his name? Gospel music man. What's his name? No, I forgot his name. Escapes me. It's come back to me. He has a brilliant historical analysis of the transition from the social environment of the spirituals to the urban environment of how it changes the lyrics. It becomes much more individually oriented. So there's a lot happening. That's why the music is deeply powerful. The music has the power to change and transform. So what would happen if in black churches every Sunday morning people singing songs about God loving their black skin? My goodness, what would that mean for the children? Oh, we can't do that. Might offend the 3 or 4 white people who come to the church. Well, hold on. But in white churches, they're singing these songs where the colour symbolism doesn't work for me. Whiter than snow? Make me whiter than snow. Well, whiter than snow in Hebrew Bible, it's from scholarship, it's a curse. It's problematic. So yeah, I think more needs to be done in that area. And there are some really good examples of where it is happening. I go back again to Barack Obama's old church, where you have people like Common coming in and doing work with the gospel art, the musicians, and talking about lyricism and ideas about how you communicate faith in relation to the world outside. So there are places where I think people are trying to touch this. Harvard and Yale Divinity Schools have really massively powerful departments of African American music and gospel music. They do 2 major conferences. They do a conference every year. I think there's 1 2 months where they do this kind of work and ask these kind of questions. I've never been invited, so it's a conference, you just turn up. But yeah, so I think there's some work where it needs to be done there. What I call for at the end of the book is a similar thing here. I argue there needs to be dialogue, and don't get me wrong, at the beginning of the book, I argue the main reason for this, I blame the theologians, and I blame it on logocentricity. How does the university validate your work? By what you write. And if all you're doing is write, and how do you really get the highest marks? If you write and have your work published in the most obscure journals that nobody's going to ever access. So who's going to read your work? So the part of the problem is we've been complicit with a system that says you have to write and publish in these places where own people can't access your work. It's madness. So hence the reason why, obviously it's slightly different for me, having spent 20 years working with visual media in terms of film, and therefore doing this kind of work. So I blame the theologians for not finding a communicative strategy or modality for engaging with the musicians of the church. And this project was about working with musicians in the studio and talking through some of these ideas as we develop the music. I'll take one more, then I think we'll have to stop.
I'm not really asking a question.
Sure, sure.
Just some comment. Actually, can I just say thank you?
Sure.
Very much for a great talk, like lots of food for thought. Is this going to be made available?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
It's going to be online on Gasworks website.
When?
Soon, we hope.
Soon. Okay, thank you. Thanks. I wanted to just come back to your comment about not knowing that what we were doing was some word verses. That's very interesting. You're completely right. Had no clue what we were doing. Didn't want to sing the song. Was horrified. Didn't want to sing something that was, so simple and seen as easy and accessible. Certain palettes, musical palettes, didn't want to do it at all. Wanted to grandstand, I suppose, in the gospel style. Anyway, that didn't happen. But what I would say, apart from, what we sing crossover music, which is becoming our USB and actually very, very powerful, and we're actually beginning to write that way. What that did for people, the wedding was actually very representative. So even 4.5 years later, people coming up in the street and saying, thank you. We are coming. I had this morning a young ex-offender say, what you're doing is not just singing. I was in prison some years ago. If I was the person today that I was then, I would never have approached you. I would walk past you with my trousers sagging below my knees. His words. That's what he said. And he said, what you did made me want to better myself. I actually think that's more subversive when people say my life turned around because of watching what you did. The other thing I want to say is I feel that there is a consciousness. Those people that you see up there in the video, highly conscious, highly politicized, highly radicalized. You just don't see it when they're up there singing Fix You or Stand By Me. But actually, if you look on our socials around the time of Grenfell, around the time of George Floyd's death, in fact, what we were doing, it was during lockdown, and we would get together on Zoom, and they were bawling their eyes out, the trauma. And actually what we did was we spoke through our socials, through what we put the video, through what Stephen Wonder's Heaven Help, which you know is a highly politicized. So what I'm trying to say is, everything you say is completely right, but I think amongst the millennials and the Gen Zs, they're thinking completely different to my generation. I'm in the 60s and 70s. And some of the things that they are wanting to say is exactly what you're talking about. In fact, tomorrow we have a meeting about writing music about climate change. Our music is pointed, and I know there's other people doing it. Our Beckford folks has released something, and other people. So I feel that it's changing, but it's taken us in this country a very long time because our parents came in the 50s and 60s and were staying for 5 years. That means they never put down roots. They were always going back. And their children were living between these two worlds of home being thousands of miles away, and where we were living in England. So we didn't have the luxury of the Americans who have been rooted in America for hundreds of years, actually see themselves as Americans. I would never call myself as English. But who does that say? What does that say about who I am?
Oh, completely. No, I agree. Look, I think there are two really important points. I think, as I mentioned before, you can have the consciousness, but the music can hold you back. And I would say that does happen during Grenfell, because you'll know we had a dialogue on this online around Grenfell, and you're very gracious in terms of how you read the work. But my argument was that Grenfell, tragedy happens, who kicks off? Stormzy. Stormzy goes to the Brit Awards, in his bare chest is saying, Theresa May, where's the money? Where's the money gone? Cusses off Theresa May. Dave does it later with Boris Johnson, cusses him off. Your album then is produced in the same year. But your album, it may have been cut before, but it doesn't register with what's happening. The lyricism doesn't directly engage in the way that Stormzy does. Similar thing happens with COVID. COVID-19 kicks off, and black people experiencing the propensity for premature death right across. It shows all the racial disparities are there. They get our friend Tony Sewell to deny it all later on with the sewage report. But it kicks off. What happens? Black church artists get together and produce a song to inspire the NHS. And what song is it? Great is Thy Faithfulness. Now, if you're dying of COVID, you're going into or you're working in a hospital where they're pushing black people on the front line, where you're not asking questions about God's faithfulness. You're asking questions about what is going on in this world. It's tragic. It's serious stuff. So I think that song was problematic. I know it was meant in the best of intentions, and I'm not knocking that. Wrong song. And I think they chose that song because we had no songs of protest or lament. Now, we made a program about this. It's on Vimeo. It's called Better Must Come, Black Pentecostals, the Pandemic and the Future of the Church, where we reflect on what was happening. There's also another example, which is then the white churches get involved. And they get credit they're the ones who Boris Johnson acknowledges. You know, Boris Johnson, that's fantastic. What do they sing? They sing the blessing song. Yeah. Now, hold on a minute. Black people dying, people in trauma, people struggling, the wickedness that was going. And what do we sing? We sing a song of saying, Lord bless us. No, my people are dying. You know, so again, I thought that song was actually quite spiritually immature. To be calling for blessing in the middle of a massive crisis where black people were disproportionately impacted, the disconnect is there. So I would argue, even though you've got the consciousness, it has to take a lyrical form. It has to be represented that way. And I'd argue what you've described is an example of what Valentina Alexander calls passive radicalism. There's the radicalism here, but has it manifested in passive ways? Second thing I would say is, crossover does offer an opportunity, a way out, but there's another hidden crossover from the 1950s. And it's the crossover that takes place in the West Indian front room. This is in the book. In the West Indian front room, my dad did this. The front room, everybody knows that. Michael Macmillan's written about this, if you want to read the scholarship on it. It's about the old English parlour. West Indian folk dressed it up and signified in different ways, put different things in the front room, everything signified. Pride of place went to the stereogram. People know what that's all. My dad used to, it's the birth of turntable technology. It's birth of hip hop, basically, before cool DJ Herc does his thing in mid-1970s. What did they do on the stereogram? My dad used to play a secular song, so he could play Young, Gifted and Black, and then play a gospel song. They play a secular song, and so he would always weave these lyrics together. So I ended up thinking that the songs were connected. Young, Gifted and Black, God is a God. I thought the songs were all meant to, but my dad was actually doing a form of crossover which allowed the lyrics, secular lyrics and sacred lyrics, to merge. Now, it didn't die at that point. It continues in the Christian sound system movement. Look at Shekinah. I interviewed some of those guys as part of it. One of them did a piece for me related to it. They do that with their mixing of music. They mix secular music and Christian music in that Christian sound system, bashment culture. They're doing it and mixing the lyrics. What I'm suggesting is there is already a pre-existing tradition of crossover going right back to the stereogram of the 1950s, 1960s, through to the Christian sound system movement, where people feel comfortable mixing secular and sacred lyrics and ideas. So I would argue that's where the music becomes the soul of the gospel rather than being soulful. That's the challenge. I think we should end on that because it's time to go. Thank you. Thank you for your questions and thank you for participating. Thank you.